Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen, Muhammad ibn Abdullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma ij'al tajammu'ana hadha tajammu'an marhuma wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'suma. ولا تجعل فينا ولا بيننا شقيا ولا محروما إنك ولي ذلك والقادر عليه. Inshallah, this will be the beginning of a series of ahadith, the 40 ahadith that are mentioned in Sharh al-Nawawi. These ahadith gives us a comprehensive understanding of our deen, the deen of Islam. And the hadith that we begin with first is the hadith that is mentioned in every book of hadith. The 6 books of ahadith, they all begin with this one hadith, which is the essence of our deen. It covers half of our deen. That with another hadith which we'll mention, that will give us a complete understanding of at least the principles that our deen are established upon. So this hadith is عن عمر بن الخطاب أبي حفص عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله وأرضاه قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كان هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته إلى دنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. This is one of the greatest ahadith that we receive from the Prophet ﷺ, which helps us establish a level of sincerity that is acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Before we begin interpreting this hadith, we give the summary of the understanding of the scholars, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commissions all mankind to worship Him and Him alone, and not to associate in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala any other entity, either aside from Allah or along with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the scholars say all mankind are doomed to destruction. And when the scholars speak as the heirs of the prophets and the messengers, we all pay attention, because they're giving us the treasures of our deen, the best of understanding of our deen, as the Prophet ﷺ commanded us to learn our deen at the hands of the scholars who are the heirs of the Prophet ﷺ, who are conveying and teaching on behalf of our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So they say that all mankind is doomed to destruction, except al-muwahhideen. Al-muwahhideen, those who bear witness that none is rightfully worshipped but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who bear witness that none is rightfully followed but His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and offer their deeds for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Him and Him alone. So all mankind are doomed to destruction except al-muwahhideen. And all of the muwahhideen are doomed to destruction except al-amilin. Al-amilin, those who do good deeds. So given testimony that there is none worthy of worship but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that His Prophet ﷺ is a sealed messenger, without performing any deeds, without performing the actionable items or pillars of Islam, will yield one no benefit. Because in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala narrates to us what the hypocrites say, which they say that which they don't do. And they conceal that which they do not utterly show. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ قَالُوا نَشْهَدُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ. When the hypocrites come to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they say, we bear witness that you are the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a statement which is similar to what the hypocrites said. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ إِنَّكَ لَرَسُولُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that you are His prophet. So there's no negation, there's no denial by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He did send Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a sealed messenger. Then in the following sentence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ يَشْهَدُ إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ لَكَاذِبُونَ. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives His testimony that the hypocrites are liars. So even the fact stay the same in the 3 different sentences that we hear. The hypocrites make that testimony without the actions to confirm that which they utterly proclaim. So this emphasizes the hadith that we're about to explain, where the Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. Means that إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ means that there's a reason why we do the deeds we do, be it worldly deeds or religious deeds. It is impossible for one to begin doing a deed, performing a task without any intention. That is impossible. To the extent that the scholars say that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commissioned us to do deeds without an intention, it would have been inconceivable, would have been impossible. Because there's some level of mental activities, there's some level of intention, there's some level of mental brainstorming or cause for the actions that we undertake. So therefore it's impossible to perform a task or to do a deed without any intention. In the second part, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. So in the first sentence, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about the cause, the beginning, the reason for doing the deeds. In the second sentence, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. For every human being that which they have intended in terms of reward. Meaning that, in the Quran, and as we know, the Quran explains the Sunnah, and the Sunnah explains the Quran as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Isra, مَنْ كَانَ يُرِيدُ الْعَاجِلَةَ عَجَّلْنَا لَهُ فِيهَا مَا نَشَاءُ لِمَنْ نُرِيدُ. Whoever is hastening towards this dunya, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant this dunya in part or in whole to whoever He wills. So in other words, whoever wants this dunya, not everybody gets it. It is He, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who determines who gets it and to what extent. That's what it says, عَجَّلْنَا لَهُ فِيهَا مَا نَشَاءُ لِمَنْ نُرِيدُ وَمَنْ أَرَادَ الْآخِرَةَ وَسَعَى لَهَا سَعْيَهَا فَأُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ سَعْيُهُمْ مَشْكُورًا. As for those who want the hereafter, and they endeavor upon the straight path, they endeavor to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they obey and they submit and they surrender to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَأُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ سَعْيُهُمْ مَشْكُورًا. For those, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has multiple folds of the rewards for them. So this explains the first part of the hadith, that those who strive for the hereafter shall receive, abundance of rewards. So this explains the intention part of the hadith. The cause part of the hadith is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَنْ كَانَ يُرِيدُ الْعَاجِلَةَ عَجَّلْنَا لَهُ فِيهَا مَا نَشَاءُ. Means that whatever the reason that people endeavor for worldly matters, as shall be explained in the latter part of the hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant them part of this dunya, or all of it for a certain duration, and then in the hereafter they receive absolutely nothing. So in the first part of the hadith talks about the reason behind us doing the deeds that we do. And that's why we ought to stop and think before we even pray, before we fast, before we perform the hajj, before we pay zakah or sadaqah. We stop and we purify the intention that I'm doing what I'm doing solely to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When I stand to pray, my intention is that this is an obligatory act of worship. It is not a habit. It's not a ritual that I'm just performing, but it's an obligatory act of worship that I've intended to render to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The month of Ramadan comes. Before I enter the month of Ramadan, I have the intention that I'm fasting on an obligatory pillar of Islam, and that is Siyam, during the month of Ramadan. Some of the scholars, they said that one intention at the beginning of Ramadan is sufficient. Some say no. Before you begin fasting every morning, you have the intention that you are fasting a day of Ramadan, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِتُكْمِلُوا الْعِدَّةَ وَلِتُكَبِّرُوا اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ. That you would complete this entire month of Ramadan, and that you would glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His guidance. And of course, measurably, you would have the intention or multiple intentions sometimes, like when we enter the masjid and the adhan has been called, and there's a sunnah, praying 2 rak'ahs in the masjid between adhan and iqamah. With that intention, I could have another intention, to do tahiyyat al-masjid. So even though I am praying only 2 rak'ahs, I can have 2 intentions, one of which is tahiyyat al-masjid, to honor the place of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted us to worship Him in. And the second is to pray the sunnah between adhan and iqamah, and you get twice the reward as well. The continuation of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, فَمَنْ كَانَ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. So whoever is hijrah means to desert a place of disbelief, where one cannot establish their deen, and to relocate to a place where one can establish their deen, like a Muslim country or a better place, even in a non-Muslim land, one area, one state, one city, one country, that I cannot establish my deen. So I go to another place where I have the freedom to establish my deen and practice the pillars of Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated for me. Then I am deserting that place that I'm being weakened and I'm being overpowered in, and I'm moving to that place where I can establish my deen. This is the hijrah that the Prophet ﷺ is talking about. فَمَنْ كَانَ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ means that the intention is to do hijrah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and obeying His Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to obey him unconditionally. Then the emphasis here, فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. The statement is reiterated to show the significance of the cause, the reason why one is making hijrah. Is that there's not a better cause than to make hijrah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as He says, فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. So whoever have hopes of meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on favorable terms, فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا, doing the good deeds, following the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam upon knowledge. وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا means that my intention cannot be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and then to please my wife, or to please my children, or to have a job there, and so on and so forth. So it has to be purely and sincerely done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He tells us in the Quran, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. That they were not commanded but to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in utmost state of sincerity, in utmost state of purity. Similarly, many of the ayat in the Quran, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. My salah, my nusuk, all acts of worship, mahyai, the cause for my life, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us right off the start, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created the world of jinn and the world of people except to worship me. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us at the tongue of His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam when He says, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ, the cause for my life, وَمَمَاتِي, the cause for my death, لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. لِلَّهِ رَبِّ, I'm on a mission. Then my mission in life is to worship none but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to fulfill all the rights and obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed upon my shoulders. وَمَحْيَايَ مَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ. That is the stipulation. So it cannot be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even 99% and then 1% for somebody else. It can't be. La sharika lah means that none whatsoever, 100%. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts nothing from us that is less than 100% rendered, for His sake. That's why the rule that we've established by default, where the scholars teach us that all mankind are doomed to destruction except al-muwahhideen, those who give their testimony of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all of the muwahhideen are destroyed except al-amilin. All of those who are muwahhideen are doomed to destruction except those who follow that statement, that proclamation with actionable items, with deeds. Okay? And all of the amilin, those who perform the deeds, are doomed to destruction except al-mukhlisin, those who are performing their deeds in a state of ikhlas, utmost purity of intention, that this is none but for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَمَنْ كَانَ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. So here, whoever's hijrah is his hijrah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to His Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, then that's the reward that he or she are going to reap. وَمَنْ كَانَ هِجْرَتُهُ لِدُنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أَوْ امْرَأَةٍ يَنْكِحُهَا فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. Whoever the cause of his hijrah is for dunya, a job, making money, living a better life, living a more comfortable life, whatever the case might be, or for a wife that they wish to, to marry. Even if they move from a city or a country that is considered disbelievers to a city or country that are considered believers, a Muslim land, they do not get the credit for that. Why? Going back to the beginning of the hadith, which is the intention. فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. Notice that in the second part, in the last part of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ did not say فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى دُنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أَوْ امْرَأَةٍ يَنْكِحُهَا, for a dunya that he or she wished to have, or for a wife that he wished to marry. The scholars say because that cause, that intention is too despicable to be repeated. It's too despised to be repeated. That's why the Prophet ﷺ did not repeat that. And he said, فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. Then his hijrah is for whatever he made the hijrah for, it doesn't count. It has no credit in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many ahadith that are mentioned where the Prophet ﷺ is asked. A person would fight out of courage. A person would fight out of hamiyya. Hamiyya means fanaticism, to protect family or to protect Muslim land, or not necessarily a Muslim, but for some sort of protection of their clans. Which one is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The Prophet ﷺ said, the one that is intended to make the word, meaning that the religion, the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the All High. And many, many other examples that are mentioned in other ahadith. So from this, when we hear questions like, and unfortunately we do hear these questions, where someone would say, why do I have to do everything that I do and say, fi sabilillah? Why can't I just do it because my neighbor is nice? Because, this is my mother, and I need to be kind to my mother. This is my father, and I need to be kind to my father. The fact of the matter is that we love our parents, we love our mothers, and we honor them and respect them. We love our fathers, and we honor them and respect them, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to do so. Not because this is my mother, and this is my father. Because this goes back to the beginning of the hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. What is my intention here? Just to please my mother? Or just to please my father? Or just to please my neighbor and say, hey, I'm a good Muslim, I'm a good person? No, that should never be the intention. The intention ought to be is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To fulfill an obligation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed upon my shoulders when He said, take care of your children. Teach them the deen of Islam. Spend from halal, permissible resources upon them. Teach them the Quran, teach them the Sunnah. So even when it comes to teaching them the Quran and the Sunnah, I don't want to teach them the Quran and the Sunnah so people will say, MashaAllah, he's a good qari. MashaAllah, he's a hafiz. MashaAllah, he's this or that. That's all you're going to get. That is the second part of the statement of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. The reward that you're going to get is proportionate to your intention. So if your intention is to say that my son is a hafiz, memorize the Quran, my son is a good reciter, that's all you're going to say. That's all you're going to get. On Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell you, you wanted people to say that your son is a hafiz, that your son is an excellent learner of the Sunnah. And they said, this is it, we're done. There's no reward for you. So you measure for that everything else. So even in matters of the deen, Satan la'anahullah will attempt to creep up on you and say, MashaAllah, people say that your son is this, your daughter is that, your father is this, your mother is that, you're courageous. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, even in the peak of our deen, when people wage jihad, he said, that which is counted fi sabilillah is the one that is offered for the purity of intention, that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the All High, that the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the All High. So if they die in that state with that intention, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ سَعْيُهُمْ مَشْكُورًا. For those indeed their endeavors shall be rewarded in the best possible ways, in unlimited ways. So if someone is to come and say, I'm doing this because my neighbor, I'm just being a nice person, then that's what you're going to get. And one way to measure, which will help us also, gauge with the rewards and to purify our intention, is if half of my deeds are done fi sabilillah, and the other half are done so people can say, he's a nice person. This is my neighbor, this is my mother, this is my relative, this is my wife, right? On Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only going to reward you for that half that is performed purely for His sake, following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So when you see these mountains of hasanat for this first half, and then you look at the other half, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to tell you, well, people said, this is it. We're done here. You receive that in this dunya. You're going to have tremendous regrets. And you're going to basically wish that you've done everything purely and sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. هذا والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show us the truth and to guide us to offer every deed that we offer for His sake. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cause us to live in the state of Islam and to die in the state of Iman. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts and our minds and our eyesights. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the kalima of ikhlas in the final moments. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cause us to meet Him in the best possible and most favorable terms. Allahumma ameen. أقول قولي هذا واستغفروه. سبحانك وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.